The lab should have never been built that close to a war zone. Tau Tsera Prime was a shattered jewel of a world, its once flourishing biosphere now little more than smoking craters and chemical storms. The Drevian Accord had designated it a red-class research world, dead, abandoned, but useful for experiments too dangerous for civilized space. Towering over the broken continent of Hekor's spine, Vault Theta was born from the bones of a long-dead mining colony. A black obelisk of alloyed, obsidian and neutron-caged steel, it pierced the sky like a needle into the god's eye. Inside, everything was sterile. White light, glass corridors, magnetic floors that hummed underfoot like a whispering conscience. But beneath the clean symmetry of its architecture, there lurked something foul. Something wrong. The kind of wrong you feel in your gut before your brain catches up. At the heart of this fortress was Subject K-47. He had no name in their records, no rank, no designation beyond a number and a file too corrupted to trace. He was found inside the wreckage of the Elysium-class stealth ship Sol's Fang, shot down during the Silent War above Dorotha's station. When Drevians arrived to scavenge, they expected debris and dead meat. Instead, they found him, half buried, under a collapsed hull, body mangled, bleeding from at least 9 mortal wounds. And still breathing. Barely. One eye open, one hand clenched around the neck of a dead Drevian officer whose throat had been crushed like soft fruit. That hand didn't loosen until they injected 6 sedatives and magnetically locked every joint in his body. They never questioned why his vital signs didn't match normal human readings. They didn't ask how a man whose lungs were collapsing could still crush a reinforced armored helm. Curiosity, arrogance, and the intoxicating scent of discovery clouded their logic, because for the first time in over 60 years of war, the Drevians had captured a living Terran soldier. Not just a soldier. A Terran Marine. Dr. Yilkra Voon, the galaxy's leading expert in xenoneurological warfare, had been waiting for this moment her entire career. Cold-eyed and brilliant beyond comprehension, she had studied humanity like one might dissect a venomous beast, carefully, methodically, never blinking. Her thesis had long been dismissed by her peers as extremist pseudoscience, that human rage, not love, not fear, not survival instinct, was the evolutionary force that propelled their species into the stars. She argued that while other sentients evolved through balance, peace, and unity, humans evolved through conflict. They bled their way through their own history, from primitive iron blades to planetary weapons that could burn moons. Rage, she said, was their compass, their identity, their fuel. It wasn't just an emotion. It was a self-sustaining biochemical feedback loop that gave them an edge no civilization could replicate. She called it the fire loop. And now, after decades of speculation and bloodshed, she had proof. Vault Theta was outfitted with the most advanced equipment in the Drevian Empire. Neural lattice scanners, emotion resonance chambers, pain cycle modulation fields. They didn't just observe K-47. They intruded. They mapped every synapse of his brain, tracked every hormonal fluctuation, recorded every heartbeat for months. They measured the dilation of his pupils when exposed to the sounds of war, the tensing of his jaw when he was shown the names of fallen comrades. They even experimented with ultrasonic triggers designed to mimic the exact pitch of Terran combat sirens, just to see what would twitch. But nothing did. He remained still, unmoving. Eyes closed. Breathing. Steady. They thought perhaps they had broken him. Too much trauma. Not enough stimulation. But deep down, Dr. Voon suspected otherwise. She saw it in the slight flick of a finger when certain names were spoken, in the way his neural activity spiked, just slightly, when he heard the word home. Even in sleep, the man radiated something not easily measurable, like an engine idling. Waiting. Then came the catalyst. A recovered memory shard, pulled from the neural cortex of another Marine killed in the same crash. The shard had degraded during extraction, but its emotional imprint was intact. The dying thoughts of a friend, pleading for K-47 to get out, to survive, to make them pay. When they injected it into his cerebral cortex, expecting resistance, neural rejection, maybe even coma, They got something else entirely. His heart rate tripled. Cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine. Every stress marker in his system spiked to levels considered lethal in Drevian physiology. Then, something new. A cascade. Muscle density increased by 17% in under a minute. Nanoscale fractures in his bones healed spontaneously. Brainwave patterns shifted from theta to gamma and beyond, into wavelengths their machines couldn't categorize. The Vault's central AI, Veilus, attempted to process the neural readouts and shut itself down in protest, declaring the data incompatible with rational analysis. The lab lights flickered. Magnetic clamps groaned. One of the containment fields melted, not from heat, but from the disruption of electromagnetic fields surrounding him. And still, he did not move. Then, the emergency dampeners failed. Just 7 seconds. A glitch. A hiccup. A whisper of weakness in a fortress meant to be absolute. His eyes opened. Both of them. And for the first time, something looked back at the Drevians. Not with confusion or fear or hatred, but with clarity. And hunger. He stood. A man who should have been paralyzed, still recovering from injuries that should have killed him. He rose as though he had simply decided gravity no longer applied. No sound, no roar, no fury. Just stillness, coiled and perfect. The air around him grew heavy, charged with something ancient, something the Drevian language had no word for, but every being instinctively understood. Danger. Imagine. Standing inside a fortress of steel, 17 floors underground, surrounded by every layer of defense science can buy, and realizing in the pit of your soul that none of it matters, that you are no longer the observer, you are the prey. Dr. Vaughn tried to speak, tried to issue a command, but her words died on her lips. Because he smiled. Just slightly. No malice. Just recognition. As if he remembered her. All monitoring. Devices shorted out in cell 9A at that exact moment. The last recorded image was a silhouette, shrouded in shadow, surrounded by chaos, standing tall. One technician panicked and ran. He made it 12 steps before his neck snapped, twisted by an unseen force. No alarms, no movement, just a soft crack that echoed like a death knell. In orbit, red alerts screamed across the high order's ships. Containment units launched. Protocols activated. Warships repositioned. And in the silence of Vault Theta's core, K-47 whispered a single word. Not in English, not in Drevian, but in a tongue older than history. One that spoke directly to instinct, bypassing the mind. And yet, every Drevian in the room heard the same thing. Run. Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to StarBound's HFY for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the fight. The Drevians had never feared anything like this. In all their millennia of conquests and calculation, they had faced weaponry designed to disintegrate entire cities, bioweapons capable of reducing entire ecosystems to ash, and armies of sentients whose loyalty could be purchased for the price of an orbital bombardment. They had built fleets larger than 1,000 suns, stacked cities upon cities in the darkest corners of the galaxy, and amassed a knowledge of war that stretched beyond even the oldest records of their people. They had never feared an emotion, but now, standing in the aftermath of K-47's silent rebellion, the very notion of fear had taken on a new shape. It was not a loud, fiery thing that shouted warnings. It was subtle. It coiled around the heart like a shadow, cold and ancient, pressing against the chest like a vice. For the first time, the Drevians didn't understand, and they hated it. The first containment unit, designated C-19, arrived just minutes after the incident, descending from the upper levels of the facility in a flash of blinding white light. Its advanced suppression fields, equipped with neural inhibitors, anti-gravity nets, and reinforced quantum locks, were designed to neutralize threats with surgical precision. The best of Drevia's military might, an elite squad of xeno-specialists, trained to handle the most dangerous species in the galaxy, had been dispatched to capture one Terran. They entered Vault Theta with a single objective: subdue or kill the human, retrieve the data, and ensure there were no survivors to talk about it. They never stood a chance. The moment the containment doors opened, the air inside the chamber thickened. It was subtle at first, a slight ripple, a soft vibration in the walls, as if something in the room was expecting them. The Drevians, trained to notice every anomaly, scanned the area immediately. Their weapons were set to high yield, ready to incapacitate in seconds. They stepped forward, their boots making no sound against the polished floor, and then the lights went out. For a split second, the room was swallowed by darkness. In that instant, every system within the facility blinked and flickered, as if the very structure of Vault Theta itself was holding its breath. The Drevians didn't panic, yet, but they could feel the change. Something had shifted. An energy they couldn't quantify rippled across the air like static electricity before a storm. Their helmets buzzed with static interference, communication, channels breaking up into distorted fragments of sound. Then, K-47 moved. No fanfare, no explosion, no flash of light. He simply moved. 1 second, he was a figure in the far corner of the room, sitting perfectly still. The next, he was standing right in front of them. The Drevians didn't see him move, not in any way they could understand. His body seemed to fold in on itself, bending the very laws of physics. No one had seen a Terran move that fast. Even with their augmented reflexes and advanced combat suits, they couldn't react in time. One by one, K-47 struck, each movement more precise than the last. A fist crushed a helmet before its wearer could even scream. A knee slammed into a chest plate with such force that the armor crumpled like paper. A twisted swipe of his hand decapitated another soldier with a single blow. The rest of the squad fared no better. In seconds, what was once a team of elite Drevians had been reduced to broken bodies, scattered across the floor like discarded toys. But K-47 didn't stop there. He didn't just kill. He hunted. The Drevians' advanced technology failed them. Their neural inhibitors fizzled, their weapons misfired, their attempts to call for backup dissolved into static. K-47 wasn't simply fighting, he was changing the battlefield. His rage was not a mere physical expression. It was a disruption. It tore apart their technology, their systems, their very understanding of combat. It was like fighting an entity that existed outside the boundaries of their training, an instinct-driven force too pure, too primal to be contained. K-47 moved with the grace of a predator, but with a purpose they couldn't comprehend. His eyes, those piercing, ice-cold eyes, tracked each victim, each movement, and he hunted them down without hesitation. He was not enraged in the way they understood rage. He wasn't a berserker, blindly smashing everything in his path. He was calm, focused, methodical. Each attack was calculated to incapacitate, to eliminate, and to terrorize. His movements were cold and surgical, as if every action was taken with the utmost precision. And yet, there was an unmistakable fire in his every action. He was not just a man. He was an idea, burning brightly with a force that was beyond any scientific measure the Drevians had ever encountered. And through it all, the Drevians tried to communicate, to reason. Why are you doing this? One of them managed to gasp through a broken helmet. K-47 didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words. He didn't need to explain what they had already done. He didn't need to justify his rage. He didn't even need to speak. He was the embodiment of something that had been ignored for far too long. The fire loop. Dr. Voon had predicted it, but she hadn't understood its true magnitude. She had thought the rage was merely a biochemical anomaly, an emotion that could be dissected and quantified, perhaps even harnessed for their own uses. But in that moment, standing outside the reinforced walls of the chamber, watching through the thick glass windows as the last remnants of the containment unit were obliterated, she realized the truth. What she had tapped into wasn't just a human trait, it was a weapon, and she had made the mistake of thinking she could control it. The room, now empty of life, hummed with a new energy. It wasn't just the silence left by the fallen Drevians. It was the aftershock of what K-47 had done. His rage had resonated through the facility, and it had left something behind. A sense of power, a ripple in the air. The kind of power that made the walls tremble with every passing second, as if the entire structure was afraid of what was coming next. Dr. Voon staggered back, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. What "Have we done?" she whispered to herself, as the door to the chamber slid shut behind her. But it was too late. There was no undoing it now. The Drevians had learned a critical truth the moment K-47 walked out of Vault Theta, leaving the wreckage of their finest soldiers behind. It wasn't just humanity's strength that was dangerous. It was humanity's rage. They had underestimated it, thinking it was a mere emotional outburst, something to be studied and contained, like any other primitive response. But K-47's actions had shattered their assumptions. He wasn't simply reacting to a threat. He was generating the threat. He had turned his rage into a force of nature, a living weapon that could tear through their advanced technology and obliterate their best-trained warriors. And with every step he took, that rage spread like a contagion, corrupting everything in its path. Dr. Voon knew this all too well. She had once thought of herself as a scientist, someone who could analyze and deconstruct the complexities of the universe. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath of that chaos, she could only feel the deep sense of dread that had settled over her. "Is it happening again?" she whispered to herself, as the first signs of the fire loop began to manifest. The fire loop, the phenomenon that had led to the creation of K-47, a human specimen selected for his ability to experience and amplify rage beyond anything the Drevians had ever observed. Voon had discovered the biochemical patterns of human anger, studied the neural pathways that activated in response to stress, frustration, and fear. But what she hadn't accounted for was the sheer depth of the emotional energy behind it, the raw power that coursed through human beings when their rage was truly ignited. And now, the loop had begun again, but on a far grander scale. As K-47 escaped the containment unit, that same fury had rippled outward, infecting others. His rage wasn't contained within the walls of the facility. It was a force, a disruptive wave that spread like wildfire through the very fabric of the Drevians' empire. Every time a Drevian encountered K-47, their fear of him grew exponentially, amplifying the emotional charge they'd felt from the very beginning. Fear fed into anger. Anger fed into panic. And that panic spread like a chain reaction until it reached the highest echelons of Drevia's command. The Drevians, never one to shy away from data collection, began recording the phenomenon. But what they found defied all logic. The effects of K-47's rage didn't just destroy lives, it rewrote the very chemistry of his enemies. It was as though his fury disrupted the neural network of any sentient near him, scrambling their cognition, heightening their own fears, forcing them to relive their deepest regrets and vulnerabilities. The more they feared him, the more their own rage bubbled to the surface, becoming a twisted reflection of K-47's own. It was no longer about physical strength or tactical superiority. It was a matter of willpower, of emotional endurance. And in this realm, humans reigned supreme. Captain Zethor, a senior officer in Drevia's fleet, had been one of the first to experience it firsthand. He had been stationed on one of Drevia's command ships when the first reports of K-47's escape came through. The captain, accustomed to managing crises with cold calculation, had expected another skirmish, a minor inconvenience that could be dealt with swiftly. But the reports only grew more chaotic as time went on. It wasn't long before Zethor found himself facing the same terror that had gripped every Drevian who had encountered the Terran. He tried to command his crew. He tried to maintain order. But the moment he set foot on the bridge, something twisted inside him. The very presence of K-47, even light years away, was enough to break his focus. He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest, his mind clouded with an unnatural anger. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented, his breath became shallow. It was as if K-47's rage was a virus, a pathogen that latched onto the mind and rewired it, infecting every thought and action. Zethor, a battle-hardened officer, felt his training dissolve beneath the weight of it. He shouted orders, but his voice sounded distant, strained, as though someone else was speaking through him. The anger in his veins burned hotter with every passing second, each heartbeat matching the erratic thrum of his pulse. And then, K-47's face appeared on the command screens. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even moving. But there he was, staring directly into the camera, his eyes cold and unwavering. That steady gaze, unbroken by time or distance, sent a shockwave through Zethor's mind, a reminder that no matter how far away K-47 was, he was always right there. The captain's vision narrowed. His grip tightened around the controls. The rage coursing through him overwhelmed all reason. He shouted, but the words came out strangled. "We have to kill him! We have to end this!" But there was no way to end it. The rage had already spread too far. Zethor slammed his fist onto the command console. His vision blurred as the pressure in his skull intensified. His crew, the men and women under his command, were no longer listening to him. They, too, had fallen under K-47's influence. Their faces were twisted in an expression of unholy fury, their eyes wide and bloodshot. It was as if they had become him. Each one infected with his rage, each one living out their darkest, most violent impulses. Zethor's hands trembled as he tried to regain control. His crew members were no longer obeying orders. They were fighting, tearing at each other, as if the ship itself had become a battlefield. The Drevians, once known for their unbreakable discipline, had devolved into savages. Zethor's mind screamed for control, but the anger had already taken root. As the ship's systems began to fail under the strain of their infighting, Zethor was forced to watch as the walls around him buckled and cracked. The fire loop had taken hold of the ship, his ship, and it was about to burn it all to the ground. In the chaos, Zethor's last thought was a singular, horrible realization. This wasn't just K-47's rage. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The fire loop was growing, and it was no longer limited to one man. It was a contagion, spreading through the very hearts of the Drevians themselves. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Drevians' empire, a sprawling network of technologically advanced planets and supercomputing systems, had never faced anything like this. The once pristine control centers and scientific hubs, places where logic and reason reigned supreme, were now overrun with the unchecked power of human rage. It spread like wildfire through the Drevians' ranks, faster than any disease, more contagious than any virus they had ever encountered. The worst part? There was no cure, no antidote, no way to stop it. Dr. Vaughn, who had devoted her life to studying alien psychology, stood in the ruins of the Drevians' central research facility, looking out at the growing chaos. The once beautiful cityscapes were now shrouded in smoke, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and synthetic fibers. The streets were littered with the fallen bodies of soldiers, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and fury. The rage had overtaken them, just as it had overtaken the officers on the command ships. Her mind raced with fear and regret. She had been part of the team that had unlocked the secrets of human rage. She had been one of the first to understand its biochemical roots, how a complex network of neurotransmitters, hormones, and electrical impulses could fuel the firestorm of anger within a human. But she had never anticipated that it could become this. She never imagined that the rage, once unleashed, could grow beyond the individual and infect an entire population. Voon's thoughts spiraled, torn between the guilt of her involvement and the cold reality of the Drevians' failing resistance. The Empire, once a symbol of untouchable power, was unraveling before her eyes. She had seen humanity's potential in the lab, but now she was witnessing it firsthand. She had to admit, with growing horror, that they had never understood what they were truly dealing with. The fire loop wasn't just a physical phenomenon. It wasn't merely a cascade of biochemical reactions or neural pathways lighting up in the brain. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. The Drevians had studied and recorded human rage, but they had failed to understand its connection to the very fabric of human identity. Rage wasn't just an emotional outburst. It was a part of the human spirit, a force that could shape and redefine a person in the most unexpected ways. Voon walked the halls of the research facility, where echoes of panicked footsteps and guttural screams bounced off the walls. The facility was on lockdown, but she could still hear the distant shouts of the Drevians, their voices rising in sync with the chaos outside. It was as if their once unshakable command over their emotions had shattered, leaving only an all-consuming fury in its place. It was infectious, and it was spreading, faster than anyone could have predicted. She reached the laboratory, now abandoned, its walls cracked and its equipment dismantled by the very subjects it had studied. The monitors, which once displayed detailed reports on human physiology and behavior, now flickered sporadically, casting eerie glows in the dimly lit room. Voon hesitated for a moment, before turning her attention to the data files left behind. The patterns on the screens were nearly indecipherable, too erratic, too unstable. It wasn't just the Drevians who were affected. The entire system was failing. Ships that had been deployed to contain the outbreak had been lost. Communication. Networks were down, and Drevian soldiers, once the epitome of disciplined warriors, were scattered and broken. Even their artificial intelligences, designed to be the pinnacle of cognitive processing, were beginning to malfunction, overwhelmed by the surge of data and emotional responses they were receiving. Voon sat down in front of the terminal, hands shaking as she tried to pull up the last set of data on K-47, the human subject responsible for triggering the initial outbreak. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the seemingly random and chaotic readings. But then, a pattern emerged, one that made her blood run cold. K-47's rage had begun to evolve. At first, it had been a primal force, something almost animalistic, in its intensity. But now, the readings showed a shift. K-47's anger was becoming strategic. It was as though the fire loop, initially a destructive force, was now developing its own intelligence, becoming something that could be manipulated, something that could be used to subjugate or even control. The realization struck Voon like a physical blow. K-47 was no longer just a vessel for human rage. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a conduit. The rage that had once been confined to individual bursts of aggression was now channeling itself into a form of collective power, a force that could manipulate minds and bend entire populations to its will. Voon's thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash outside the lab, followed by the unmistakable sound of Drevian soldiers rushing through the corridor. She knew they were coming, for her, but there was nowhere to hide. The fire loop was beyond containment, and she was now a part of it. A thought flickered in her mind. She could escape. She could leave. Find a way to escape the system before the entire empire collapsed. But as she looked around the facility, at the utter devastation that had already consumed everything, she realized it was too late for that. The Drevians had made their choice when they decided to experiment with human rage. Now, they would pay the price. And that price would be more than just their empire. The fire loop had already spread beyond the Drevians. It was taking root in the very stars themselves. As the battle raged across Drevia's homeworld, Voon's thoughts turned to the larger question that had plagued her from the start. What would happen when the fire loop spread beyond their borders? What would happen when humanity's rage reached the farthest corners of the galaxy? Would the entire universe be caught in the storm? As she stood, staring at the flashing terminals and the distant sound of chaos growing closer, she knew there was no turning back. The Drevians had unleashed something far more powerful than they could ever have imagined. And now, it was only a matter of time before humanity's rage consumed everything. The galaxy had never known a storm like this. The Drevians, in their arrogance, had thought that by studying humanity, they could control it. They thought that by unraveling the neural and biochemical threads that connected a human to their rage, they could weaponize it. Instead, they had unwittingly unleashed a force far more profound than they could ever have predicted. The fire loop had become more than just a physiological response. It had become an existential contagion, a flood of energy that rippled outward, its effects spreading to every corner of the galaxy. What had started as a simple curiosity about human behavior had now grown into a force of cosmic scale, one that no civilization, no matter how advanced, could control. Dr. Voon stared out of the ruined facility window, watching as the storm of chaos unfolded in the streets below. The once proud streets of Drevia, lined with grand monuments and towering structures, were now filled with the sounds of destruction. Buildings crumbled to the ground as Drevians, once the pinnacle of technological and intellectual achievement, raged against one another, overcome by the very emotion they had so meticulously studied. Their once orderly society had fallen into anarchy, and there was no one left to stop it. The Drevians' leaders had tried everything: suppression drugs, control signals, even attempts at reasoning with the minds of their people. But nothing worked. Humanity's rage was not just a passing emotion. It was a flood that could not be dammed. Foon's hands trembled as she watched the unfolding carnage. Her mind was torn, caught between a deep sense of guilt and awe. The Drevians had thought they could harness human anger as a tool. They had sought to study it, break it down into its constituent parts, and learn to manipulate it. But in doing so, they had miscalculated. Rage, they had discovered, was more than just an emotion. It was the purest distillation of the human spirit, a force so raw and primal that it could break free of the constraints of logic and reason. And once it was unleashed, there was no controlling it. The Drevians had given humanity the tools to take that rage beyond their own planet, beyond their own species, and into the stars. For the first time, Voon understood the true depth of humanity's potential. She had witnessed it in the lab, in the controlled environment of her experiments. But she had never imagined it could become something like this. Human rage was a driver, a force that pushed them forward, that spurred them to defy the odds and conquer the impossible. And now, it was spreading to every corner of the galaxy. She stood motionless as her thoughts raced. The Drevians had thought they could cage this emotion, could make it predictable and controllable. But they had failed. And in their failure, they had ignited something far greater. All over the galaxy, the fire loop was spreading, infecting alien species in ways the Drevians had never anticipated. The Krita, a technologically advanced race of cybernetic beings, had been the first to experience the fury of the fire loop. Their once precise calculations and algorithms had become erratic, influenced by waves of irrational emotion. Once stoic and calculated, the Krita now waged battles with an intensity and savagery that had never before been seen in their history. The Kator, a species known for their peaceful and diplomatic nature, had turned into a war-hungry, violent faction consumed by irrational impulses. Entire fleets of peaceful explorers had been reduced to wandering marauders, chasing the endless adrenaline rush that came with conflict. But it wasn't just the aliens who were affected. The human colonies, scattered across various star systems, had begun to experience the effects of the fire loop in ways even Voon couldn't predict. Colonists who had once lived in harmony, focused on rebuilding after centuries of war, found themselves lashing out at one another, caught in the grip of an all-consuming rage. Families turned on families, neighbors became enemies, and the fire loop, once contained within a single experiment, had now engulfed entire human populations. What had been a single spark was now a roaring blaze. Voon's heart sank as the reality of the situation settled in. The Drevians had failed to grasp the true nature of the fire loop. They had mistaken it for a fleeting emotional outburst, something that could be manipulated and controlled. But they had underestimated one crucial element of humanity, their ability to evolve with their emotions, to adapt and use those feelings in ways no other species could understand. The fire loop had become a living entity, constantly shifting and growing, a force that changed as it interacted with new environments, new minds, and new experiences. It was evolving, she realized. It wasn't just affecting those it touched. It was transforming them. The rage had become a weapon, yes, but it was also a catalyst. It had unlocked something in the human psyche, something buried deep beneath the surface. It wasn't just anger or violence, it was ambition. Humanity's drive to conquer, to push beyond their limits, to take what they wanted by any means necessary. The fire loop had given them the means to not just fight, but to win. And in their newfound power, they had begun to shape the galaxy. In their image, the Drevians had thought they were studying human rage, but in reality, they had been watching the birth of something new. The fire loop had become a living organism, feeding on the anger, fear, and pain of those it touched. It was expanding, like a virus that mutated as it spread, adapting to each new host. It was taking on a life of its own, one that was fueled not just by the chemical reactions of the brain, but by the collective will of every human and every alien it encountered. It was no longer just an experiment. It was a force of nature. Voon looked out into the horizon, the sky above Drevia now a swirling tempest of dark clouds and flashes of lightning. The fire loop had consumed everything, and now it was on the verge of consuming the entire galaxy. She knew that the Drevians had no hope of stopping it. The knowledge they had gained had only served to empower it. There was no way to turn back now. Humanity's rage had gone beyond containment, and with it, They had unlocked the key to the galaxy's future. As she turned to leave the research facility, a single thought echoed in her mind. Humanity had become the storm, and there was no escaping the fury that they had unleashed.